Raymond Edmonds was born on March 12, 1944 at the Queen Victoria Hospital in Melbourne, Australia. Melbourne in the 1940s operated on trust, with many families choosing to keep their doors and windows unlocked. Very little is publicly known about Edmonds' early childhood or the household he grew up in. What is known, however, is that by the time he reached adulthood, Edmonds had already developed a pattern of predatory behavior that most people in his life would never have suspected. By his early to mid-20s, Edmonds found work as a sharecropping farmer on dairy properties throughout Victoria. The nature of his farm work had one particularly significant side effect. The combination of dairy milk residue, manure, and the chemical compounds used in farm cleaning permeated his skin and clothing constantly. People who encountered him described a powerful, unpleasant body odor that lingered in the room long after Edmonds had left. Family and colleagues stated that he seemed to lead a mundane life and was a simple, hard-working man. Little did they know that this ordinariness was nothing more than a performance. His private behavior was characterized by escalating violence, predation, and a pattern of exploitation that began within his own family. Edmonds married twice in his life and had children. His relationship with his first wife was deeply abusive. He had allegedly assaulted and beaten her. The abuse quickly extended beyond his wife when he began violating his daughter. The abuse of his daughter remained hidden for decades, concealed by the isolated dynamics within the family and social silence. Eventually, Edmonds began to expand his crimes to people outside of his family. This initially took the form of watching women through windows and following them in public. This came to a head on February 10, 1996. That Thursday evening, the Shepparton Civic Center was hosting an event called the Mod Spectacular, a concert that had drawn a crowd of approximately 1,500 teenagers. Among them was 16-year-old Abina Madill. Abina was the middle child of Fred and Dalma, a farming family from nearby Yambuna who had relocated to Shepparton in the early 1960s so their daughters could have better academic opportunities. She was described as spirited and always smiling. She had recently begun a job as an office clerk at a vehicle repair business called Shepparton Motor Panels. She attended the concert that night wearing a skirt, new white sandals, and carried a white shoulder bag. Her father, Fred, drove her and her younger sister, Rosalind, to the Civic Center at 8:40 p.m., picking up two friends, Janice Frost and Ray Croxford, along the way. Abina had also made arrangements to meet her boyfriend Ian Urquhart, who would be coming later in the evening to pick her and her friends up when the concert ended. Ian was working late at a Ford dealership where he was completing an apprenticeship. Also attending the event, though unrelated to Abina's group initially, was 18-year-old Gary Charles Haywood. He was described as tall, handsome, and popular. Gary was the eldest son of a prominent local family and worked as a panel beater at his family's vehicle repair business, the same company where Abina had recently started work as a clerk. He had planned a quiet night at home with his girlfriend Gail, as he was short on money and not expecting his pay until the following day. But Gail chose to stay home and Gary changed his mind, deciding to attend the concert. Before leaving, he and his 14-year-old brother Alan washed Gary's dark green FJ Holden sedan that he had meticulously restored and maintained. Alan begged to come along, but Gary gently refused and drove to the event alone. When Abina arrived, she did not immediately go inside with her sister Rosalind. Instead, she and her friend Janice walked around the corner to where Gary had parked outside the Star Bowling Alley on Friar Street. He was sitting with three friends, Victor, Paul, and Lindsay. The group drove together to Victoria Park Lake, a popular late-night gathering spot at the heart of the city, arriving just after 9 p.m. The boys drank beer, and Abina and Janice were offered vodka mixed with orange juice. Abina accepted, which left her somewhat unsteady. Within roughly half an hour, the group returned to the concert. Gary and another friend went inside to watch, while Abina and some of the others waited outside. Janice, growing increasingly uncomfortable with the behavior of one of the boys in the group, eventually walked away from the car and went inside the Civic Center alone, spotting her boyfriend and leaving with him. As she and her boyfriend drove past the location where Gary's car had been parked, they noticed it was already gone. Abina's boyfriend Ian, finishing his shift and tidying up, walked to a nearby cafe to meet friends before heading to the Civic Center to collect Abina. When he arrived and found her sister, who told him Abina had gone out driving with Gary, Ian became visibly upset. Struck by jealousy, he shouted that he would kill him. Real quick, if you haven't done so already, go follow my Spotify linked in the description. I upload videos there early, sometimes up to a week before they pop up on YouTube. And now back to the video. Ian and his friend Peter Hazelman drove Rosalind home and then spent time searching the town for Gary's distinctive green car. Finding nothing, Ian eventually returned to the Medill house and waited on the street outside. Abina's mother, Alma, arrived home after 1 a.m. and discovered her daughter was still not back. Her husband, Fred, drove to the police station but found it empty, as both the night shift constables were out on patrol. He called the station and reached Constable Frank Eyre. By 3 a.m., the situation had escalated. Both the Medill family and the Haywood family were involved, and Gary's father was personally searching the town alongside the constables. Early on the morning of February 11th, as officials drove back to the station, they spotted something that immediately seemed suspicious. Gary's car was found parked in Wyndham Street, but it had been left haphazardly, approximately 5 feet from the curb. The engine was cold, the tank was half empty, the windows were down, and the keys were missing. The blue-checked rug that Gary always kept folded in the back seat was also gone. Everyone who knew Gary knew he would never abandon his beloved car in such a state. Its discovery transformed the dynamics of the case instantly. Something had gone terribly wrong. What followed was one of the largest search efforts Victoria had seen to that point. Police, the families, volunteers from the community, and more participated in the investigation. Divers searched bodies of water, while aircraft scoured surrounding bushland. More than 100 volunteers joined the search, including all the employees of the Haywood family's business. Within days, a critical piece of evidence surfaced. 2 days after the disappearance, an elderly man cycling along a bridge over Castle Creek, 13 miles south of Shepparton, spotted a white leather shoulder bag in the creek bed below. He took it to a local police station. Inside were a £1 note, some coins, a key case, handkerchief, and tissues. The name Abina Medill was printed on the bag's inner lining alongside her address. Meanwhile, detectives took custody of Gary's car and examined it thoroughly. During that examination, 2 unidentified fingerprints were detected on the top of the driver's side door. Investigators deliberately chose to keep this information private, so as not to alarm the culprit into becoming more cautious. Alleged sightings of the pair flooded in from across Victoria and beyond, giving brief false hope to the families. Police pursued each lead, but they all proved fruitless. On Saturday, February 26th, 16 days after the disappearance, 2 17-year-old boys arrived in the small town of Murchison East, almost 20 miles southwest of Shepparton, for a weekend of hunting. They were visiting family in the area and entered a stretch of forest along the Goulburn River through a paddock they knew well. As they walked, they noticed an unusual smell in the air and assumed it was from a dead animal. On their return trip through the same area, they discovered the source. Lying face up in the paddock was the severely decomposed body of a young woman, naked from the waist down with severe injuries to her head. One of the boys alerted the landowner, who contacted police. Officers attending the scene were then told by the property owner that he too had smelled something in a different part of his paddock, near a cluster of trees approximately 300 meters away. There, under a 30-foot tree, they discovered the clothed body of a young man with a single bullet wound to his left temple. The victims were confirmed as Abina Medill and Gary Haywood. West of Abina's body, investigators found 2 pairs of her stockings, each tied tightly into loops. Matching fibers on Gary's pants confirmed that his legs had been bound with those stockings. His sweater was found nearby, covered in grass seeds, bark, and leaves, and stained with blood. Abina's skirt had been left folded neatly near her body, with one white shoe beside the pile and the second placed on top. At the scene, investigators also found a second fired .22 caliber casing, which suggested the killer had fired at Gary twice but only struck him once. A small black piece of plastic was also recovered, later identified as the plug from the end of an American-made Mossberg rifle. The keys to Gary's car were not found at the scene, nor was the blue rug from the car. Based on the evidence, officials believe the assailant had abducted both teenagers at gunpoint, most likely from the area near Victoria Lake. Dust particles on Gary's car matched soil samples taken from the paddock. Gary appeared to have struggled, either fleeing or being marched into the cluster of trees where he was bound and shot. The perpetrator then returned to Abina, who was either restrained or had been rendered unconscious. He then assaulted her and beat her to death. The killer subsequently drove Gary's car back into Shepparton, abandoned it on Wyndham Street, and disposed of Abina's handbag along the Goulburn Valley Highway as he departed. Investigators described the murders as beyond comprehension and the most brutal killings they had ever encountered. Gary's mother, Margaret, lost significant weight in the aftermath and struggled to maintain her will to live. His younger brother, Alan, was left terrified, convinced the murderer would come back for him next. In the immediate aftermath of the discovery, police pursued hundreds of leads, and a $10,000 reward was offered for information. The Mossberg rifle became a major focus. Since it was an American firearm and relatively uncommon in Australia at the time, police contacted manufacturers in the United States to obtain import records and cross-reference those with sales records from Australian gun dealers. A total of 353 rifles were tracked down and test-fired throughout the subsequent investigation, with spent casings compared against those recovered from the crime scene. None matched in a way that identified a suspect. At one point during the initial investigation, a police constable had attended a farm in Arcadia to question a 22-year-old share farmer. This farmer happened to be Raymond Edmonds. His name was provided to officials via a tip from an anonymous individual. The property owner told the constable that Edmonds had recently moved with his wife and their young children to Moulamen, a small community in southern New South Wales. The constable was given a forwarding address and left. After he departed, the property owner remembered something. Edmonds owned a .22 semi-automatic Mossberg rifle, which he used for rabbit hunting. He had assumed that was the reason for the constable's visit, but failed to update officials about it. Edmonds was never followed up on. Between 1966 and 1970, the investigation had expanded significantly, and over 3,000 individuals were formally interviewed. But every lead eventually collapsed into nothing. In June 1970, 4 years after the murders, a formal coronial inquest was held into the deaths of Gary and Abina. The delay itself spoke to the futility of the investigation. When asked by the coroner why the inquest had been postponed for so long, Detective Parkinson said, "Inquiries have been at many stages looking good and then come to utterly nothing. At many stages, we have had great hopes of solving it, but without result." Abina's father, Frank, told the inquest that his daughter had been a normal girl and that he could think of no reason why anyone would want to harm her. Charlie Haywood also described his son Gary as a regular person who never caused any drama. Despite being officially cleared as a suspect by police in mid-1966, Ian Urquhart's name was nonetheless placed on the record at the inquest, with testimony noting that he had been very annoyed upon learning Abina had gone driving with Gary. He was living in Singapore at the time and was not called to give evidence. What followed was not careful detective work. The Melbourne Homicide Squad had a well-documented reputation during this era for extracting confessions through physical force. Ian was summoned repeatedly to the Shepparton police station, where he was subjected to prolonged formal interviews during which detectives verbally abused him, slapped him, and kicked him. They were convinced he had done it, and they believed that persistent pressure would produce a confession. One detective, after a particularly aggressive session, reportedly told a colleague that he had, quote, belted and belted Ian, but he will not confess, framing his refusal to confess as stubbornness rather than innocence. Ian confided in friends that he was terrified of what the police might do to him. At one point, he told family members he was considering confessing to the murders, not because he was guilty, but because he thought that admitting to it was the only way to make the beating stop. In Victoria at the time, a false confession to a crime of this nature would almost certainly have resulted in his execution. His sister Heather convinced him not to go through with it. His alleged accomplice, Peter Hazelman, was also subjected to aggressive police interviews, though with somewhat less intensity. In mid-1966, several months after the murders, police officially ruled Ian out of their investigation. Two detectives visited his sister Heather to inform the family, and they acknowledged somewhat reluctantly that the questioning of Ian had been, quote, particularly tough due to the seriousness of the case. That acknowledgement was as close as any official ever came to apologizing for what had been done to him. But it changed nothing. The media's treatment of Ian had already run its course, and the community's suspicions had solidified. Despite the official clearance, his name remained on the minds of neighbors, co-workers, and even some members of the police force. And so the harassment continued. Unable to live normally in Shepparton, Ian relocated first to Western Australia, where he found work on an oil rig, and then to Singapore, where he took up contract work as a maintenance specialist on offshore drilling operations. His friend Peter also left, working on an oil rig off the Victorian coast before eventually settling in Darwin. In Singapore, Ian built a new life. He had a career, an income, and distance from his past. On Friday, February 11th, 1972, almost exactly 6 years to the day after Abina was murdered, he and a work colleague flew back to Singapore from a job in Sumatra. They disembarked their flight shortly after midnight and left the airport together in Ian's car. While driving along a highway, Ian crashed the vehicle and both he and his passenger were killed instantly. One ex-homicide detective who had been involved in the case commented upon hearing of Ian's death, saying he finally got what he had coming, still believing Ian had been guilty. While the Shepparton murders lay cold and Ian's name faded from the headlines, Raymond Edmonds was moving south. By the early 1970s, the rural farmland of eastern Melbourne was rapidly being subdivided and converted into residential housing. The suburb of Donvale, over 100 miles south of Shepparton, was filling with new homes and young families, which to Edmonds looked like opportunity. On the evening of Monday, July 26, 1971, 25-year-old Suzanne was home alone in Donvale with her 3 children while her husband was traveling overseas. After putting the children to bed, she was mopping the kitchen floor. At around 10 p.m., she went to the laundry to collect clean water and stepped into the hallway where she came face to face with a man she momentarily mistook for her husband returning home early. His face was covered by a makeshift mask from a stocking. In his raised right hand, he held a long butcher's knife. Suzanne screamed and the man told her to keep quiet and said he didn't want to hurt her, then backed her into the kitchen and demanded money. He then ordered her to undress. Understanding what was about to happen, Suzanne told him she had recently given birth and still had stitches. The man appeared to pause, then told her he was only going to tie her hands and feet and leave. He restrained her wrists behind her back with a stocking and tied her ankles together. Then he began assaulting her. She screamed loudly and the man fled. Suzanne freed herself and immediately called police. The following year, in August 1972, Edmonds returned to Donvale and committed another burglary and assault. The details of this specific attack are less clear, but it was confirmed to have been related to Edmonds. By this point, police in Melbourne's eastern suburbs were aware they had at minimum a repeat burglar with a pattern of targeting women at night, but they did not yet know the full scope of what they were dealing with. That the same man had murdered 2 teenagers in Shepparton 6 years earlier and left unidentified fingerprints on a car that was sitting in a police archive. After the 1972 incident, there seemed to be a gap in the documented crimes. Whether or not he was truly inactive during this time is unclear. By January 1976, he had selected a new target, this time in a suburb of Beaumaris. 8-year-old Eloise Ann Worledge lived in a home on Scott Street. She was the eldest child of Lindsay and Patsy. Lindsay was an academic and lecturer at the Caulfield Institute of Technology. Patsy was a vibrant, outgoing student teacher with a passion for art. Their 2 other children were 6-year-old Anna and 4-year-old Blake. Eloise was described as quiet, intelligent, and sweet-natured. She was close to her mother and was involved in a number of clubs. Beneath the surface, however, the household was under significant strain. Lindsay and Patsy's marriage had deteriorated to the point of collapse. Lindsay had been scheduled to move out on January 10th, but had postponed the departure, adding further tension to an already difficult environment. Both parents had been involved in extramarital affairs. The children didn't fully understand the circumstances, but were certainly aware that something in their family was not right. On January 12, 1976, Lindsay had work obligations and spent time drinking with friends afterward. He then returned home and played Monopoly with the kids. He continued to drink before falling asleep in front of the TV. Patsy attended a ballet class that evening and then had an outing with friends. She arrived home to find the front door unlocked and ajar, which she didn't immediately find alarming. She checked on all three children before going to bed, recalling that she kissed Eloise at approximately 11 p.m. Eloise was in her bed, appearing to be asleep. Lindsay later told police he had also checked on the children at around 11:40 p.m. The hallway passage light, which was normally left on for the children and switched off by the last parent to go to bed, was left on that night. Patsy confirmed this when she woke at approximately 4:45 a.m. to use the bathroom. The light was then already off. At around 7:30 a.m. on January 13th, 4-year-old Blake entered his parents' bedroom and reported that Eloise was not in her room. He would later tell police he had heard what he called robbers during the night, but had been too frightened to speak, fearing that whoever had come for his sister would take him too. When Lindsay and Patsy entered Eloise's bedroom, her bed had clearly been slept in, but she was gone. The screen on her bedroom window had been cut and rolled upward, and the window was fully open. Bark from the tree outside the window had been found on the floor inside the room. Sergeant Cyril Wilson arrived within 8 minutes of the first call and immediately called for backup. Within 30 minutes, local detectives were on the scene. What followed was what police at the time described as the largest missing person search operation in Victorian history. More than 250 officers deployed over 18 days. Over 6,000 properties in the city were canvassed, including rural bushland and more. No trace of Eloise was ever found. Forensic examination of the window screen produced an intriguing finding. The hole in the mesh had been cut from the inside, not from the outside. The dust and cobwebs surrounding the window frame were undisturbed, making it highly improbable that any adult had climbed in or out through it. The window opening itself was only 15 inches across and was considered too small for an adult to pass through without disturbing the intact debris around the frame. Police concluded that the window scene had almost certainly been staged, either by someone inside the house who wanted it to appear like an outside break-in, or by an intruder who had entered through the front door. Multiple neighbors reported suspicious activity in and around Scott Street on the night of the disappearance. At around midnight, a woman named Ann Same observed a young man walking along the fence line of the Worledge property, which made her feel so uneasy that she crossed to the other side of the street to avoid him. At approximately the same time, another neighbor, Molly Saltz, witnessed a young man jump the fence onto the property after running in front of her car. At 2 a.m., two separate neighbors reported hearing a child cry out and a car door slam. A dark green car was then seen speeding down Scott Street. A separate person reported an unfamiliar green Holden station wagon parked near the Worledge home at some point during the night that she had never seen before. This vehicle, which may have matched a Holden stolen weeks earlier in the area, was never located. In the days before the disappearance, multiple other residents had also reported intruders on their properties at night. This detail, though initially noted, was not immediately connected in any meaningful way to the disappearance. Lindsay became the initial focus of the investigative attention. He was a heavy drinker, his marriage was collapsing, and the interpretation of the window suggested an inside connection. He denied any involvement and underwent a polygraph test in 2002, but the results were inconclusive. A 2001 police cold case review found no evidence implicating either parent. Lindsay died in 2017, still under a cloud of public suspicion. Raymond Edmonds was formally identified as a person of interest during the 2001 review. He was known to be active in Melbourne suburbs during this exact period, operating as a nighttime home intruder with a pattern of entering through unlocked doors or windows. His geography and methods overlapped with the circumstances of Eloise's disappearance in significant ways. At the 2003 coroner's inquest, Constable Robert Nazaretian confirmed Edmonds had been examined as one of the suspects. No conclusive evidence linking him to Eloise was ever established, and he has never been charged in connection with her disappearance, but the case is widely believed to have involved him. By 1977, Edmonds' string of attacks had attracted enough police attention to earn the Unknown Predator an official moniker. Between 1971 and the late 1970s, there had been at least 12 documented crimes and attempted assaults throughout suburban Melbourne attributed to a single unidentified attacker. Police had given him the name the Donvale Rapist based on the suburb where his earliest known attacks had occurred. But as the range of the crimes widened, a second detail kept appearing in every survivor description, that being the smell. Victim after victim independently described the same overpowering, distinctive body odor emanating from their attacker. It was characterized as a combination of strong cigarette smoke, heavy body odor, and something chemical. It was this recurring trend that caused a newspaper to publicly rename the unknown attacker Mr. Stinky. By this point, police had assembled a composite sketch of the unknown criminal based on descriptions from 8 survivors and 2 witnesses. He was assessed as being between 34 and 44 years of age, with a pale complexion, standing between 5 feet 4 inches and 5 feet 6 inches tall, with sandy or reddish blonde hair and long, bushy sideburns. A sculptor was commissioned to build a 3-dimensional bust of the suspect. The bust, which police nicknamed Boris, was used to solicit public tips. Despite widespread coverage of Boris, no meaningful identification resulted. It was also established during this period that Edmonds had been working night shifts as a security guard and later for a company that installed gates and fencing. This employment gave him access to extended nighttime hours, knowledge of residential neighborhoods in his areas, and an understanding of which homes were occupied by women alone. He explicitly told one victim during an attack that he had been watching her for over a week before breaking in. Around February of 1977, Edmonds broke into a home in Dingley and committed another burglary and assault. In March of the same year, Edmonds returned to Wheelers Hill, the suburb he had first targeted in October 1976, and violated another woman. Then in May, he targeted a 31-year-old single mother whose 6-year-old daughter was asleep in her room. Edmonds entered the home wearing a stocking over his head and confronted the woman, threatening that he'd kill her daughter if she did not comply. What makes this attack particularly significant in the wider record is what happened to the daughter in the years that followed. The child heard what was happening that night. According to later statements, that little girl grew into an adult who could never again sleep alone. This persisted well into her adult life and even after she married. This woman eventually took her own life. A fourth attack in Wheelers Hill occurred in July, bringing the count for that single suburb to 4 within 9 months. Of all the known suburban attacks, the September Edith Vale incident is often regarded as the most viscerally disturbing in terms of the circumstances under which it was carried out. Edmonds broke into a home and violated a woman in the lounge room of her home while her toddler was present in the same room. Edmonds showed no hesitation or restraint. By 1980, the crimes deviated from the current trend of assaults and revolved around a 39-year-old woman named Elaine Jones. Each new year, the Jones family made the 5-hour drive north from their home in Box Hill to the town of Tocumwal on the banks of the Murray River. Alan Jones, Elaine's husband, would set up the family's camp at Town Beach, and the family would spend the long summer holiday swimming, fishing, and relaxing by the water. In January 1980, Alan and Elaine camped at the beach with 2 of their 4 children, daughters Nita and Jennifer. Their eldest son Gregory and daughter Pauline had not joined the trip that year. The Jones family were regulars at the campsite and well known to the other holidaymakers and local residents who frequented the area over the summer. On the night of Thursday, January 3rd, 1980, Elaine left the campsite at around 9:30 p.m. She was heading to the local cafe along the river path from the campsite. The cafe was open late and the path was both direct and short. However, Elaine never returned. When Alan woke on the morning of Friday, January 4th, he found his wife missing. He and his daughters immediately began searching the riverbanks on foot. Then Alan and Jennifer took a boat out onto the Murray River and continued searching from the water. Shortly after, they found the answer they had been dreading. Elaine's naked body was floating in the river, pressed against a fallen log. She had suffered severe injuries to her neck and head, and her throat had been cut. Alan pulled his wife's body out of the water and into the boat. The shock and emotional devastation of that moment triggered a massive heart attack, and Alan died on the spot. Jennifer was then alone in a small boat with both of her parents dead beside her. She eventually made it back to shore and got help. New South Wales homicide detectives responded to the scene. The investigation that followed was severely hampered by the absence of any meaningful physical evidence. No crime scene was ever conclusively identified, as Elaine had disappeared from a public walking path and could have been taken from any number of locations along the route. Only a single sneaker belonging to her was recovered anywhere near the area. There was no blood trail, no sign of a struggle at a specific location, and no murder weapon. Some individuals in Tocumwal and at the campsite described seeing a tall, muscular man wearing Speedos near the campsite on the night of January 3rd. A photo kit composite was created from these descriptions and circulated through the media, but no one came forward with a definitive identification. At the time, Edmonds was employed in Tocumwal, and officials noted that the attack on Elaine was consistent with his pattern of targeting isolated women. Police formally identified Edmonds as one of only 3 suspects ever seriously considered in connection with Elaine's murder. The third suspect was Alan Jones himself, though Alan's death immediately upon discovering his wife's body, combined with the complete absence of any evidence of discord between the couple, rendered his involvement essentially inconceivable to investigators within days of the crime. Despite multiple attempts to question Edmonds about Elaine Jones's murder, he has consistently refused to discuss it. He did not confess and was never charged for her death. The final phase of the attacks began in 1983. In September of that year, there was one assault in Greensboro tied to Edmonds. It was noted that back in January of 1975, there was another case that Edmonds committed in the same area involving a 23-year-old woman named Kathy. She was living with her 2 kids while her fiancé was away for work. Edmonds entered through the laundry at around 4:10 a.m. while the woman's young son was sleeping in the same bed as her, and her infant daughter was in a cot in the nursery. He stood in the bathroom doorway brandishing a 12-inch blade. The woman screamed and falsely told him a friend was staying in the guest room and had likely already called police. Edmonds responded saying, "It's a lie. No one will see you for a couple of days until your husband gets back." He then forced her back to her bed, placed a blanket over her sleeping son, and assaulted her. Fingerprints were recovered from that scene, matching those from the 1971 Dawnvale attacks. Then in 1984, Edmonds began operating in Clayton. The exact date is unclear, but he abducted a woman, imprisoned her, and assaulted her. This displayed a major divergence from his typical crimes, where he simply violated his victims in their own living spaces. The last known attack in his formal record occurred in February 1984, also in Clayton. Edmonds yet again burglarized a home and assaulted a female resident. While investigators were building a profile of Mr. Stinky from victim testimony, a fingerprint expert within the Victoria Police made an observation that would break both the investigation and the 1966 Shepparton murders simultaneously. Sergeant Andrew Wall was examining fingerprints from the known crime scenes when he noticed a striking similarity to a set of unidentified prints that had been lifted from Gary Haywood's abandoned car back in February 1966. The conclusion, if confirmed, was staggering. The man who had been assaulting all of these women in Melbourne throughout the 1970s and early 1980s was the same person who had murdered 2 teenagers in Shepparton nearly 2 decades earlier. The fingerprints were consistent. Investigators now had a link between 2 seemingly separate criminal histories, but still had no name, face, or location for this unidentified man. By early 1985, Edmonds was 40 years old and had been committing crimes across Victoria for nearly 2 decades without ever being formally identified. In March, he was in Albury, parked in his Ford station wagon outside a department store called Walton's. At some point during the afternoon of Saturday, March 16th, a woman named Pat Halpin noticed Edmonds in his vehicle and was disturbed by what she saw. He was touching himself inside his car in broad daylight. Halpin went into the Walton store and reported what she had seen to staff, who then called the police. Constable Glenn Taylor responded to the call and approached the vehicle. He tapped on the driver's window and Edmonds looked up. Taylor informed him he was being detained for obscene exposure and asked him to identify himself. Edmonds gave his name and did not resist. He was calm, cooperative, and viewed this as nothing more than a minor inconvenience. In his mind, he had committed far worse and walked free every time. He had no reason to believe that this would be any different, but this event would turn out to be his undoing. In Victoria in 1985, there was no requirement to fingerprint a person merely upon arrest for a minor offense. If Edmonds had committed that same indecent exposure in Melbourne about 60 miles south, he would have been charged, fined, and released. His prints would not have been taken. The Shepparton print match would never have been tested, and the man behind the crimes would never have been revealed, but the offense took place in New South Wales, where the law was different. The state had, at that time, a mandatory fingerprinting provision attached to any arrest, regardless of the seriousness. Edmonds was taken to the police station, charged, fingerprinted, and released after paying a $400 fine. The fingerprint cards were forwarded to the fingerprint database and were then made available for comparison. They were examined in Sydney, and the examiner who assessed them made a comparison against the records that Victoria Police had flagged through their interstate communication channels. The comparison came back 6 days after his arrest. The prints matched. Raymond Edmonds' middle and ring fingers were identical to the unidentified prints found on top of Gary Haywood's car. They were also identical to the fingerprints recovered from numerous crime scenes across Melbourne over the preceding 14 years. Senior detectives at Victoria Police were immediately informed. On the morning of March 22, 1985, detectives visited Edmonds' address and took him into custody. In the initial stages of questioning, Edmonds denied any involvement in the Shepparton murders. He was presented with the fingerprint evidence, but he continued to deny being responsible. After some time in questioning, Edmonds made an unusual request. He asked to speak with a Catholic priest before he would say anything further. The request was granted. A priest was arranged, and Edmonds was given time for a private conversation. What passed between Edmonds and the priest in those minutes was confidential, and their exchange never made it to public records. When Edmonds emerged from his private conversation with the priest, he spoke to detectives. He confessed to the murders of Gary Haywood and Abina Medill. The version of events he provided was detailed but not entirely truthful. According to Edmonds' account, he had encountered the teens at Victoria Park Lake on the night of February 10, 1966. He claimed the encounter was not initially aggressive. He had spoken with the pair, joined their group in some capacity, and events had escalated from there. He drove the teenagers to the area near Murchison East and described shooting Gary and beating Abina to death. Several aspects of his account were immediately contradicted by the physical evidence from the 1966 crime scene and by what investigators knew about the condition of the victims. In particular, Edmonds' description of how the sequence of violence unfolded was assessed by detectives as a version designed to minimize his culpability in specific ways while acknowledging the central facts that had already been proven. He could not deny being present at the scene. He could not deny handling Gary's car. The prints had proved those two facts. What he could attempt to control was the narrative of what had happened and why. Investigators accepted the confession as truthful in its core elements while treating aspects of the surrounding account with skepticism. Following the confession, Edmonds agreed to accompany detectives to the crime scene. He was transported to the paddock along the Goulburn River where the bodies had been discovered. He walked investigators through the sequence of events as he claimed to remember them. In the days following the arrest, investigators faced a constraint that would later generate significant criticism of the legal system. At the time, Victoria's laws governing police detention time imposed a strict limit on how long a suspect could be held for questioning before they had to be charged or released. This meant that detectives questioning Edmonds had an extremely limited window in which to also question him about the dozens of other crimes they believed he had committed over 14 years. But the cases were not abandoned. Charges relating to 5 other crimes were ultimately prepared alongside the murder charges, but investigators assessed that dozens more attacks had occurred for which Edmonds was responsible and for which he would never face consequences. Edmonds was committed for trial and appeared before an Australian court in 1986. He was convicted of the double murder of Gary and Abina. The sentencing judge described his crimes as horrific and terrifying. He was sentenced to 2 life terms with no minimum for the murders, meaning he would never be eligible for release. On top of the life sentences, he received an additional 30 years for 5 counts of assault in connection with the Greensboro and Donvale attacks that had already been linked to him at the time of trial. While Edmonds was imprisoned, investigators in the late 1990s and early 2000s began revisiting the 1976 disappearance of Eloise Worledge with fresh eyes. In 2001, the Homicide Cold Case Squad commenced a new review of the case, which included re-examining all persons of interest. Raymond Edmonds was formally identified during this review as one of the key suspects alongside a teacher from Eloise's school and a member of a local theater group. In 2003, a formal coroner's inquest was held. The inquest returned an open finding, providing no closure for the Worledge family. Eloise's mother, Patsy, told the coroner that the family had found their own form of personal peace with the uncertainty, though the renewed investigation had been extremely difficult to endure. In 2017, a cold case team launched an 18-month investigation into Edmonds' crimes that had never resulted in charges. Investigators reviewed every prior investigation connected to his case files and re-interviewed surviving victims. In January 2019, then 74-year-old Raymond Edmonds was formally charged with 31 additional offenses relating to 11 separate incidents. In May 2019, he appeared via video link at Melbourne's County Court and indicated he would plead guilty to 10 of the charges, covering 9 separate victims. His defense lawyer, Peter Chadwick, told the court that when asked why he had waited so long to come forward about these crimes, Edmonds had no explanation, but he did say he believed it was time to bring peace of mind to himself and his victims. On September 26, 2019, Edmonds was sentenced for the new convictions. The court added 23 years and 5 months to his already insurmountable sentence.